Some time ago, my boyfriend had his car broken into while he was parked outside a small grocery store. His wallet got stolen. It had everything in it, from his ID to his credit cards. He filed a report with the local cops, but the officer pretty much said it was a dead end since a string of thefts had happened in that area. No one was looking into it seriously, and honestly, it felt like they just didn't care. Fast forward about 7 months, and out of nowhere, I get this phone call. The guy on the other end says he's a cop. He tells me they found a bunch of wallets and purses in a dumpster near a rest stop just off the state highway. He says my boyfriend's wallet was in the pile. Apparently, they'd tried to call my boyfriend using the number on his driver's license but hadn't gotten through. I remembered he'd switched numbers about halfway through those months. The officer then says he found a photo of me in the wallet, a passport-sized picture I'd given my boyfriend ages ago that I absolutely hated. For some reason, he loved carrying it around. Plus, my business card was in there too, with my work picture on it, so it made sense the cop tried my number. He offered to meet me and give the wallet back since the police station holding it was a 2-hour drive from my town. He suggested meeting at a small cafe just outside the city, right off the main road. I recognized the spot he mentioned. It was a dingy little coffee shop that barely seemed open most days. The idea of meeting there immediately felt off. Why would a cop go out of his way to hand over a wallet at a random coffee shop instead of dropping it off at the closest precinct? And why reach out to me instead of my boyfriend? It didn't add up. I told the man I appreciated the effort, but if the wallet was found, he could just leave it at the police station, and I'd arrange to pick it up myself. His insistence made me uneasy, so I politely declined, hung up, and decided to double-check the whole situation. I called the police station he claimed to be from, explaining the story. They confirmed that my boyfriend's wallet had been found with a bunch of others in a trash bin near the rest stop. But when I asked about an officer arranging to meet me at a coffee shop, the tone on the other end of the line changed. The person I was speaking to sounded confused and a bit alarmed. He assured me that no officer would ever make such a request. In fact, he emphasized that only the owner of the wallet could retrieve it, and it would have to be directly from the station. As I hung up, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd gone to that quiet, isolated coffee shop. Was the caller really an officer bending the rules, or was it someone else entirely? Someone with far worse intentions? The realization made me sick to my stomach. Even now, when I think about it, I get this cold, sinking feeling. I'll always be grateful I trusted my gut that day. Whatever the man on the phone had planned, I'm glad I'll never know. When I was 22, about 4 years ago, I went on a date with someone I'd met through a dating app. I like to meet up with people pretty quickly after chatting, just to see if there's any chemistry in person. This time was no different. We decided on a small restaurant. Not fancy, but not a dive either. For the sake of the story, let's call my date Chris. Chris seemed nice enough when we were texting. He was funny, respectful, and didn't come across as pushy or weird. So I thought, why not? But as soon as I saw him in person, I realized I might have been wrong. He was trying way too hard to be funny, and it got awkward fast. I'd arrived a few minutes early, and he was already there waiting. Everything seemed okay when he greeted me, though the fist bump he tried to give me was a bit much. Then, as we sat down, he grinned and said, "Wow, I'm so glad you're not catfishing me." I cringed but brushed it off. As the date went on, things got worse. Every time I said something, he made a joke about it. When I told him about my job, he smirked and said something like, "That's a big role for a woman. You must be one of the smart ones, huh?" My stomach dropped. I shot him a look, but before I could respond, he followed up with another comment that was somehow even worse. I calmly told him his jokes weren't landing, but he just laughed and shrugged it off, doubling down on his humor. By this point, I knew it was going to be a painful evening, but I was already there and hungry, so I decided to stick it out. He didn't stop there. He kept the jokes coming, about my job, my hobbies, even how I pronounced certain words. At one point, he randomly asked how many people I'd slept with and then said, "You don't seem like the type to sleep around. Good for you." I was stunned. I told him straight up that his question was inappropriate, but he just laughed and said I needed to lighten up. By now, I wasn't just uncomfortable. I was furious. He wasn't done being a jerk, though. He made fun of the meal I ordered, mocked the drink I chose, and even joked about me ruining my figure if I ordered dessert. I wasn't about to let his stupid comments get to me, but I was done. I skipped dessert, not because of him, but because I couldn't wait to leave. By the time we left the restaurant, I was beyond done with Chris and his non-stop nonsense. As we stepped outside, I turned to him, and with the fakest smile I could muster said, "Thanks for meeting up. It was interesting getting to know you." My tone made it pretty clear I wasn't into him. At least I hoped it did. He asked how I planned to get home, and I told him I was just going to walk. It wasn't a long distance, it wasn't late, and the streets were well lit. I felt confident making the walk alone. But Chris wouldn't drop it. He kept insisting on walking me home, saying stuff like, "It's not safe for a girl to walk by herself." I politely declined, saying I'd be fine. Still, he kept pushing. I even started walking to make it clear I didn't want his company, but he just fell into step beside me like we were suddenly best friends. My frustration grew, but I didn't want to make a scene. Finally, I sighed and said, "Okay, you can walk me part way, just to my street." That seemed to satisfy him. He lit up, like I'd just agreed to a second date or something. He babbled on as we walked, cracking more terrible jokes and trying way too hard to be funny. I gave him the bare minimum of responses, just enough to keep things civil, but not enough to encourage him. I already had a plan brewing. There was no way I was letting him know where I actually lived. When we were about 5 minutes from my real address, I turned into a random street, pointed down the block, and said, "This is me." Chris looked pleased with himself, like he thought this whole night had gone great. He gave me a weird, overly long hug that left my arms pinned awkwardly at my sides. I grimaced through it, mumbled a goodbye, and waited for him to leave. He turned and walked off, still grinning. I stayed put until he was completely out of sight, then quickly headed toward my actual street. Relief washed over me as I neared my house. Unlocking my door, I was already planning to unmatch him and block his number as soon as I got inside. Just as the key slid into the lock, I froze. I heard footsteps, fast ones, closing in behind me. My heart jumped into my throat, and pure panic kicked in. I flung the door open, desperate to get inside. But before I could, I felt arms wrap around me from behind, shoving me into the doorframe. The impact left me off balance, half inside, half out, with the door swinging wide open. I couldn't move, pinned sideways against the frame. Hot breath brushed against my ear, and my mind raced with terror. A low voice hissed in my ear, "You didn't think I'd figure out you lied about where you live, did you?" My blood ran cold. My mind spiraled to the worst possibilities. This was it, I thought. This psycho was about to hurt me, maybe kill me. Just as quickly as the grip had closed around me, it was gone. The pressure lifted, and then I heard laughter, loud, mocking, and cruel. I spun around, my heart pounding, and there he was, Chris, standing a few feet away, bathed in the yellow glow of the streetlights, laughing like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. A wave of emotions hit me all at once: terror, rage, humiliation. I could barely form the words, but I managed to shout, "What the hell is wrong with you?" His laughter finally started to fade, but his smug grin stayed plastered on his face. He shrugged and said something about how he knew I'd lied about where I lived, that he could tell I wasn't into the date, and he thought pulling a prank would be a good way to break the ice. "I thought it'd make you laugh," he said, as if that made it better. My anger exploded. I started yelling at him, telling him how horrifying it was for a woman to be followed home, grabbed, and whispered to like that, how incredibly stupid and reckless he was. But he just stood there, looking confused, like he genuinely didn't get why I was so upset. I couldn't believe how clueless he acted. I pointed to the street and yelled, "Get the hell off my property and never come near me again." He tried to mumble some sort of half-assed apology, but I wasn't having it. "Leave!" I screamed. Finally, he turned and shuffled off, still muttering under his breath like I was the one being unreasonable. As soon as he was gone, I slammed my door shut and locked every bolt and chain. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and immediately unmatched and blocked him on the dating app. Thank God I hadn't given him my number or any of my social media info. I called my mom and then my best friend, needing to vent and make sense of what had just happened. Both of them were horrified and furious on my behalf. They told me I'd done the right thing, but their reassurance didn't make the fear go away. I kept thinking about how easily that night could have gone differently. I felt sick knowing he'd figured out where I lived, even if he didn't come back. That thought kept me on edge all night, and I barely slept. My roommates were out of town, so the house felt impossibly quiet and empty. Every little noise had me jumping out of my skin. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the unease. I was paranoid about being alone, constantly checking over my shoulder when I walked anywhere. Eventually, I moved out of that place a couple of years later, and I felt a weight lift as soon as I left. But the memory of Chris and his prank stayed with me. If by some chance he ever reads this, all I can say is, screw you. I hope I never see your face again. I want to warn you that this story has mentions of abuse, control, and unhealthy relationships. It's important to note that since this time in my life, I've grown stronger, started therapy, and now help others who face similar challenges. I met this guy, let's call him Liam, back when I was a freshman in college. He showed up in my life right when I was reeling from the end of a bad relationship. At first, he felt like a lifeline. We clicked immediately, and within a week or so, we were officially a couple. Looking back, I realize how foolish it was to think things could turn out well when, within 2 weeks, I let him put a ring on my finger. I was barely 19 and thought I had found the one. For a few months, everything seemed picture perfect. He was charming, thoughtful, and made me feel like I was living in some sort of fairy tale. But slowly, the fairy tale turned into something much darker. It started with small things, like him suggesting what I should wear or what to eat. He'd insist I spend time with him doing things I wasn't really interested in. I told myself it wasn't a big deal at first, that he was just being caring. But it didn't take long for his suggestions to feel more like demands. I'll never forget the first time he crossed the line. I was sitting at my desk, trying to finish a paper, and he barged in, demanding I go with him to some club meeting he thought was important. When I refused, he slammed my laptop shut, my fingers still on the keyboard, and glared at me like I was the one out of line. I was scared, but I brushed it off and went with him to the meeting. I didn't know how to stand up for myself back then. After that, his control over me tightened. Everything revolved around what he wanted. If he was in the mood for sex, it didn't matter if I wasn't. If he was hungry, we ate when and what he wanted, even if I wasn't feeling it. He dictated my wardrobe, my hobbies, even the way I talked to people. I lost count of how many times I gave in just to avoid an argument or his anger. It reached the point where I barely recognized myself. One day, after a long shift at work, I asked for something specific for dinner because I was finally trying to regain control over my weight. His eating habits had left me feeling sluggish and unhealthy, and I wanted to change that. But of course, my wants didn't matter. One day, Liam brought me something completely different from what I'd asked for. My coworker, trying to make a joke, asked him if he was trying to make me gain weight. Without hesitation, he shrugged and said, "Yeah, so no one else will want her." That line has haunted me ever since. It was one of the first cracks that led to my binge eating disorder. For years after that moment, I felt trapped in my own body, ashamed and unsure of how to fight back against the person who claimed to love me. After 4 years of this nightmare, I finally worked up the courage to end things. I told him it was over, but it didn't go as planned. When he came over to grab a few of his things, he lashed out. He wrapped his hands around my throat and squeezed until I thought I might black out. My instincts told me to freeze, to not fight back, and somehow that moment passed. But instead of walking away for good, I made the mistake of taking him back. That terrifying act opened the floodgates for more abuse. It wasn't just emotional or mental anymore. It became physical, and the sexual assaults became constant. If I ever said no, it didn't matter. He'd hit me and take what he wanted anyway. Eventually, I just learned to endure it. Pretend. Go numb. It wasn't just in private either. If I disagreed with him or tried to assert myself in public, he'd give me a look, a warning. Everyone else might think it was just a glance, but I knew what it meant. Keep quiet, or pay for it later. And when I didn't listen, the punishments grew worse. Sometimes, he'd lock me in the closet. The lights were outside, and I've been terrified of the dark for as long as I can remember. The hours I spent in that small, pitch-black space felt endless, and all of it was part of his plan to break me. He wanted me to feel worthless, to keep me looking as undesirable as possible so no one else would want me. If he even suspected another man or woman looked at me, I'd pay the price. It didn't matter if it was innocent. I was always the one who got punished. The last straw came on a night I'll never forget. He forced me to drink until I could barely stand, then violated a boundary I'd always made clear was non-negotiable, even during his worst moments. I'd trusted him to at least respect that one line. He didn't. I was tied up, gagged, and helpless. All I could do was cry. I knew then that if I didn't leave, I wouldn't survive. With the help of my now best friend, someone I owe everything to, I finally broke free. I never went to the police. I had no evidence, and I was too scared no one would believe me. He had stripped me of my confidence, my self-worth, and my voice. Since then, I've started therapy to heal from the anxiety, depression, and PTSD he left me with. It's been a long road, but I'm finally able to talk about what happened. I share my story in the hope that it might help someone else. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please don't wait. It's terrifying and it's hard, but you're stronger than you think. Watch for the red flags and don't ignore them. Stay safe. You deserve so much better. The first time I met this guy, something insane happened. We went from a casual dinner date to me being surrounded by SWAT teams, barking dogs, and at least 20 guns pointed in my direction. It felt like a movie, but I was the unlucky star. Let me explain how everything spiraled out of control. It was 2016, I think. We connected online, just casual messages at first. His name was Alex. We weren't hitting it off in a fireworks kind of way. No sparks flying, no butterflies. But we had a decent rapport. It turned out he knew someone from my circle, my cousin's friend or something like that. Facebook does weird things like that, doesn't it? Anyway, he wasn't blowing me away with charm, but he wasn't boring either. He talked a lot about his family, his work, his friends, stuff that made him seem normal. Still, it wasn't exactly the kind of vibe that makes you count the hours until your next chat. Over a month went by before Alex finally asked me out. It wasn't a grand gesture or anything romantic. The message just said, "Want to hang out?" Nothing more. I remember laughing at how bland it was. Still, I agreed, because why not? It took us another week to actually plan the date. We decided on dinner at this little restaurant in the city, a walk afterward, and maybe, just maybe, we'd head back to my place. Nothing too fancy, just simple and relaxed. Or so I thought. Dinner started out fine. We ordered wine, shared a couple of appetizers, and it felt like things might actually work out. He wasn't blowing my mind, but he was nice enough. Then, midway through dessert, Alex excused himself to the restroom. No big deal, right? But then, this random guy, dressed in plain clothes, sat down in Alex's chair. At first, I thought he was a waiter or someone needing the table, but nope. The guy leaned forward, reached inside his coat, and pulled out one of those cop badges you only see on TV. You know the kind, tucked inside a leather flip case, like something straight out of a crime show. I froze. What was happening? Why was this guy at my table? And where the hell was Alex? The badge looked ridiculously official, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie about crime lords. It had the Chicago Police Department emblem on it, but the guy wasn't in uniform. Instead, he was dressed like he could have been anyone, a random dad grabbing dinner or maybe an accountant. My mind instantly jumped to detective or undercover cop. I've heard enough family stories, Both my grandparents were in law enforcement, to know the drill. But this was next level weird. Alex, meanwhile, was still in the bathroom, blissfully unaware. The cop leaned in close and said quietly but firmly, "You're not leaving here. The man you're with is being taken into custody. Stay calm. Don't tip him off." His voice was steady, but his words made my heart drop like a stone. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He straightened, gave me a long look, then left without another word. I watched as he walked out, turned left past the restaurant's big front window, and disappeared like a ghost. I sat there frozen, trying to process. Was this some elaborate prank? Maybe Alex set this up to mess with me? Or was he actually hiding something? Some huge secret that was about to explode? My head was spinning, but I tried to keep my breathing steady. If nothing else, I figured I hadn't done anything wrong. At least I hope not. About 5 minutes later, Alex wandered back to the table like nothing had happened. He sat down, picked up his fork, and dove right back into his dessert. He even smiled at me like we were having the best time. It was surreal. I couldn't stop staring at him, trying to figure out if this was a man with a secret past or just some poor guy about to get blindsided by the cops. He must have noticed because he gave me a confused look like, "What's up with you?" I forced a smile and took another sip of wine, willing myself to act normal. When the waitress brought the check, I jumped at the chance to focus on something else. I offered to split it, and though Alex protested, I didn't give him much of a choice. I slapped down some cash while he paid the rest with his card. By the time we stood up to leave, my nerves were in overdrive. The plan was to walk back to my place, but all I could think about was the cop's warning. As we stepped outside, the chilly air hit me, and I felt like I was walking straight into a trap. My mind was racing. Should I tell Alex what the cop said? Should I warn him? Or would that make me an accomplice to whatever he'd done? None of it made sense. Instead, I tried to play it cool, convincing myself it was all a mix-up or maybe one of those prank videos people post online. You know, the ones where fake cops show up to mess with strangers just for laughs. Yeah, that had to be it. Right? It's wild how much power a badge, or even the idea of a badge, has over your mind. That's what I kept telling myself as we left the restaurant. Maybe the whole thing was a joke, some YouTuber outside trying to catch reactions. I scanned the area, looking for cameras or anyone suspicious, but there was nothing. The street was quiet except for a couple of people having a smoke. Alex held the door open for me, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. We walked out, turning left down the same street where the undercover cop had disappeared earlier. The air was chilly, and I focused on keeping my breathing steady. The first 10 minutes of the walk back to my place were uneventful, just the usual small talk. Then, everything changed. Suddenly, headlights flooded the street, and a black Mercedes screeched to a stop inches behind us. The tires let out an ear-splitting squeal, and before I could process what was happening, 2 men jumped out, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked. My heart stopped. A second later, more cop cars swarmed the street, tires screeching and sirens blaring. Within moments, we were boxed in, shoved against a tree in someone's front yard. I could barely think. There were at least 20 officers surrounding us, rifles pointed with 3 snarling K9 units snapping at their handlers' leashes. It was pure chaos, and I was in the center of it. We didn't have a choice. We dropped to our knees as they screamed instructions, hands behind our heads. Then we were ordered to lie flat on the cold pavement. My face was pressed against the ground, my body trembling uncontrollably. I could barely breathe as officers swarmed over us, patting us down and checking for weapons. My mind kept screaming, "This is it. I'm going to die." They pulled out IDs next. Alex was processed first while I stayed pinned to the ground, every muscle in my body stiff from fear. Then came the bombshell. They had the wrong guy. Alex wasn't who they thought he was. He wasn't the armed robber they'd been hunting for the past 20 hours. The resemblance, they said, was uncanny. I couldn't believe it. Even I started second-guessing myself for a split second. The cops weren't messing around. They were certain he was the suspect until his ID checked out. As soon as they realized their mistake, the apologies started pouring in. They must have said sorry 100 times. But the damage was done. My heart was still racing so fast that I thought I might pass out. They called for medics, and it turned out I'd had a panic attack, not a heart attack, which honestly felt just as bad. Alex didn't say much afterward. He looked shaken, and who could blame him? Sure, he could have sued, but honestly, I doubt it would have gone anywhere. The cops had acted in good faith, just really bad luck for him. So yeah, that's my first date horror story. I know plenty of people have had bad dates, but being seconds away from possibly getting shot because your date looks like a fugitive, that's a level of terror I wouldn't wish on anyone. This happened back in February 2023. Let me set the scene a bit. My name's Sophie, and I'm 23. I'm originally from a small town in Oregon, but I've been living in Seattle for school. I was at that point in my life where I felt stuck. Every relationship seemed to go nowhere. After overthinking for months, I decided to have my first real intimate experience with a close friend. Later, I started seeing someone casually, and everything felt easy for a while. But after 3 months, they ghosted me, leaving me crushed because, stupidly, I still loved my ex. That was when I hit rock bottom and tried something reckless. It landed me in the hospital, then in a mental health ward. For months before all this, I'd been spiraling, drinking too much, staying out late, and ignoring every red flag. Coming out of the hospital, I wanted something to distract me, so I turned to dating apps. I was desperate to move on, meet someone new, and just forget about the mess I'd made of everything. It wasn't like I had any experience with dating anyway, so I figured, why not? I'd meet guys at my apartment because it felt safer than being out in public. One day, I matched with this guy named Lucas. He wasn't good looking, overweight, scruffy, but I wasn't trying to date a supermodel, so I swiped. We chatted a little, joked about dumb stuff, and realized we both liked weed. Perfect, I thought. At least we could chill and get high together. Lucas shared some basic details about himself, his address, his last job. He'd just been let go. I didn't care much about his work situation since I wasn't planning on anything serious. I told him outright about my depression and my hospital stay, just to set the tone. I needed him to know I wasn't in a place to deal with games. I also made it clear that I wanted something casual but meaningful, like fun, conversation, and affection. None of that hit it and quit it nonsense. He assured me that he was all about cuddles and companionship, which sounded perfect to me. Within a couple of days, we set up a date at my place, a mojito and movie night. He promised to bring joints too. When Lucas showed up, it was underwhelming. He looked worse than his pictures. Oily hair, a stained hoodie, and the vibe of someone who hadn't tried in years. I wasn't thrilled, but I felt too lonely to send him away. I had him mix drinks while I picked out something to stream. We settled on the couch with our mojitos, and I quickly realized he wasn't much of a conversationalist. He was dull, almost blank. But I kept sipping my drink, thinking maybe the buzz would help. That's when everything started to blur. What happened next is mostly pieced together from what Lucas told me later. Apparently, we drank, smoked, and watched the movie for a while before heading to my room. I vaguely remember lying in bed, naked, and seeing him standing there fully dressed, staring at me. Then he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. My phone was completely dead, so no alarm went off. I had a group project meeting that morning, but I didn't show up, which immediately made my friends worry. They tried calling me repeatedly, but when they couldn't get through, they reached out to my older sister. She tried to get a hold of me too, but all her calls went straight to voicemail. Feeling uneasy, my friends decided to come over to my place to check on me. They rang the buzzer over and over, but I didn't answer. At this point, they called the fire department for help. The firefighters managed to open the building's front door but couldn't get into my apartment itself. They banged on my door, yelling my name, and eventually, I opened it. I was wrapped in a blanket, looking totally disoriented and clearly naked underneath. I had no idea what was going on, and my confusion seemed to reassure the firefighters, who assumed I was just hungover. They left while my friends came inside to help me. As they started gathering my things, they noticed something weird. My arms, legs, and stomach were smeared with a yellow antiseptic, the kind hospitals use. I mumbled something about burning myself the night before and treating it, but there were no burns on me. What really freaked them out? I didn't even own any antiseptic like that. My friends decided I wasn't safe to be alone and took my cat and me to one of their places. I was basically in a daze the whole time. My speech was slow and jumbled, like my thoughts couldn't connect. Even my sister, who picked me up the next day, said I looked like I was completely checked out. She brought me back to her house, worried I might try to hurt myself again, thinking I had overdosed or mixed alcohol with medication. But that's when things got worse. I started complaining about sharp pain and bleeding down there. Alarmed, my sister rushed me to the ER. I was terrified and mumbled something about possibly needing to file a report because I'd been unconscious. I didn't know if anything had happened, but the possibility of something unprotected made everything more horrifying. The hospital staff ran a ton of tests on me and advised me to contact the police. I was sent to see an OB specialist that same night. By the next morning, my head began to clear a little. My family noticed right away that I seemed more alert and connected to what was happening around me. But the doctors ordered more tests, swabs, preventative treatments for STDs, and blood work. Over the next week, I had a string of appointments for follow-ups. Meanwhile, I finally filed a police report, backed by statements from my friends and sister who had been with me through this nightmare. As I spoke to others about it, friends, older folks, and even medical staff, I started hearing the same word over and over: organ trafficking. The idea made my stomach turn. People suggested the guy might have panicked and backed out at the last second. Still, despite filing a report and all the strange evidence, my bed covered in antiseptic, my ripped underwear, the dried blood smears on my apartment door, the police said they didn't have enough to go on. To this day, I don't know what happened during those 3 blank days. I don't know what that guy wanted or what he planned to do, but I know one thing for sure. I've never had a blackout like that before. I've mixed alcohol and medication before, and never lost time like that. I'm almost certain he spiked my drink. Talking about it doesn't change the past, but at least I'm not holding it all inside anymore. Thank you for listening. When I turned 20, I finally got into dating. To explain a bit, I'm a girl and pretty new to it all. I matched with this guy on a Facebook dating group. He was some distant connection of a friend's friend. His name was Ryan. He was tall, had messy brown hair, and tattoos covering most of his right arm and hand. From our chats, he seemed pretty chill, so we planned to meet at a coffee shop not far from my apartment. I live in a mid-sized city, but the cafe we picked wasn't super crowded that late morning. Ryan was right on time, and when he arrived, he went straight for a hug. It didn't feel forced or anything, so I didn't mind. We grabbed drinks and a couple of pastries before finding a table by a big window. The light streaming in made everything feel cozy and calm. Ryan, who said he was 23, looked a bit bulkier than I expected in person, but I didn't mind. I'm not picky about that stuff. He wore a snug t-shirt, and I couldn't help but notice how much it showed off his arms. When I asked about his tattoos, instead of explaining them, he smirked and asked, "Want to touch one?" I laughed awkwardly, but ran my fingers over the ink on his forearm. "They're cool," I said, trying to keep it casual. That's when things started to get strange. Ryan flexed his arm suddenly, which threw me off. I nervously pulled my hand back, but he caught it and pressed it firmly against his bicep. "Feel how strong I am?" he asked, grinning like this was supposed to impress me. For a second, my mind scrambled. Should I make a scene? Just stay calm? My gut was screaming something was off. I took a breath and firmly told him to let go of my hand. His laugh after that still haunts me. It wasn't normal. It sounded fake, almost like someone pretending to be human. When he let go, the air between us turned cold and uncomfortable. I sipped my coffee, pretending like I wasn't completely on edge. To steer the conversation back to normal, I asked again about his tattoos, but he dodged the question. Instead, he launched into a rant about his love for working out. I laughed nervously, trying to go along with it, and said, "Yeah, I can tell you're into fitness." He beamed at that and went on about how being strong was everything to him. On the surface, his words weren't alarming, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The way he'd grabbed my hand earlier still lingered in my mind, like some strange warning sign. When he stopped rambling, he looked me in the eye and asked, "So, what do you think of my muscles?" His tone was almost demanding, so I mumbled something like, "Yeah, it's cool that you're into working out." That wasn't enough for him, though. He leaned in closer and repeated the question, this time with a strange intensity. Feeling trapped, I just nodded and said, "Sure." His smile stretched a bit too wide, and he took a long sip of his drink, leaving me squirming in my seat. By then, I was desperate to get out of there. I kept glancing at the clock, willing time to move faster. I even caught myself fantasizing about those fake emergency calls people pull in rom-coms. You know, the ones where someone urgently needs to leave because of some made-up crisis? But this wasn't a movie, and I had no easy way out. I tried shifting the conversation to something safe, work, hobbies, anything, but he wouldn't let it go. Instead, he leaned back and casually said that he was into girls who worship his muscles. His exact words. It wasn't just that he said it, it was the way he said it, like he expected me to be thrilled. Now, I'm all for people being into what they're into, but this was our first date, and he'd already grabbed my hand and made things super awkward. Not exactly first date material, you know? Trying not to panic, I forced a laugh and asked, "How'd you figure that out about yourself?" Big mistake. That question opened the floodgates, and he launched into a way too detailed explanation. By the end of it, I was itching to escape. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and said I needed to use the restroom. He noticed me taking my stuff but didn't say anything, which was both a relief and unsettling. Once I was in the bathroom, I locked the door and called my mom. Her advice? Be honest, say I wasn't feeling it, and leave. Simple enough, right? Except I have this awful habit of not wanting to seem rude, even when I'm uncomfortable. I ended up hiding in there way too long, overthinking everything. When I finally made up my mind to fake being sick, I stepped out and found him staring straight at the bathroom door, like he'd been keeping watch the whole time. That sent a chill down my spine. I forced a sheepish smile and told him I wasn't feeling well, blaming an upset stomach on the wrong kind of milk in my coffee. I even threw in a line about being lactose intolerant, hoping he'd buy it. The irony of that excuse wasn't lost on me. He didn't call me out, though. He just nodded like he believed me, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. He walked me to the bus stop, and just as I thought I was in the clear, he leaned in for a kiss. I turned my head so fast, it probably looked like I was dodging a punch. Once I was safely on the bus, I blocked him on everything and vowed to steer clear of anyone remotely connected to him. Looking back, it's not the most terrifying story ever, but there's something deeply unsettling about how normal people can seem online, only for their true selves to surface in the worst ways. Ryan wasn't just weird, he was obsessed, with himself, with control, with making me uncomfortable. The red flags were there from the start. I just wish I'd seen them sooner. You'll want to hang on tight for this one. I'm a woman, and for simplicity, let's call me Mia. About 12 years ago, I dated a guy. Let's go with the name Jake. We were in our early 20s, and the whole thing only lasted about half a year. Friends had warned me about Jake's controlling and manipulative side, but he seemed so sweet around me that I ignored them like a fool. He had his quirks, though. Whenever we went out, bars, clubs, whatever, if anyone even glanced at me, he'd tense up, gripping my hand or sliding his arm around me like he was claiming territory. I shrugged it off because, honestly, I wasn't a fan of random guys hitting on me anyway. But soon, he started demanding more and more of my time. He'd guilt-trip me for wanting a night to myself, making me feel awful for just wanting space. I've always been someone who needs alone time to recharge, and after about 7 months, that part of me was driving him crazy. He couldn't handle it. And now we're getting to the part that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. I've had a best friend since 6th grade. Let's call him Alex. We were practically siblings growing up. Our families were close, and since he was an only child, I think he saw me as the sister he never had. Even before he told me, I knew Alex was gay, and I was there to support him when he came out to his parents in high school. Years later, he went off to college out of state, while I stayed local. Eventually, Alex got married to his boyfriend, and I was honored to stand by him as his best woman at the wedding. We stayed tight over the years. I even made him the godfather to my daughter. Around this time, one of our mutual friends passed away suddenly. I was devastated and told Jake I needed some time alone. I didn't want to talk, text, or see anyone, not even him. Alex, being the amazing friend he always was, dropped everything and flew back last minute to be with me. He stayed at my place since it was late by the time he arrived, and the funeral was scheduled for early the next morning. We'd always been close like that. Sharing a bed was no big deal. Even our parents used to joke about how nothing was going to happen since we weren't each other's type. When it got late, we both crawled into my bed, just like old times. No big deal, right? My room is at the very back of the house, tucked away in a dark corner. It's far from the front door, and the house itself is a decent size, so I didn't think twice about telling Jake he wasn't welcome. Plus, Alex had a flight back home just a few hours after the service, so I figured there was no point in starting drama. I drifted off pretty quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I felt something brushing against my face, gentle at first, like a whisper. It pulled me out of sleep, and before I could make sense of what was happening, there was this blinding light. Then, I heard his voice, Jake's voice. "You know, I could kill you both right now, and no one would even know I was here." My stomach dropped. He was standing over the bed, holding a gun, his face twisted with anger. "So, this is why you've been avoiding me, you dumb slut?" His words stung, but fear overtook me. He turned to Alex and sneered, "What about you? Do you like stealing other people's women?" I jumped in, trying to keep calm. "Jake, shut up. This is Alex, the friend I've told you about 1,000,000 times." But he wasn't listening. Jake's eyes flicked to Alex, sizing him up. Alex, who was barely 5'3" and maybe 125 pounds soaking wet, didn't flinch, even though Jake was a solid wall of muscle at over 6 feet tall. "Dude, you have no idea what you're talking about," Alex said firmly. "I'm gay. I'm married." But Jake just laughed, shaking his head like he didn't believe a word. Thinking fast, I blurted out, "Look at his phone. Check his pictures, his texts. You'll see he's telling the truth." Jake hesitated for a moment, then stormed over to the nightstand and snatched Alex's phone. He scrolled for a minute, his jaw clenching tighter with every second. Finally, he flung the phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. "Guess what?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You being a fuck just saved your lives." My blood boiled, but I held it together. "Get out of my house," I snapped, my voice shaking with fury. I stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway casting a sharp shadow across the room. Jake sauntered over to me, smirking like this was all some big joke. As he walked past, he leaned in close, planting a kiss on my neck while his hand gripped the back of my head. I froze, disgusted and terrified. Then he whispered, "It's handy, you know, having an uncle who's a locksmith." He stepped back, pointing the gun at me as if to mock shoot. "Pow," he said, laughing as he walked out, his laughter echoing in the dark. The next day, I filed for a restraining order. Jake violated it more times than I could count before the police finally put him behind bars. After he got out, he moved on to his next victim, leaving me in peace. I heard through the grapevine that his story didn't end well. He's now in a maximum security prison for attempted murder, several counts of assault with a deadly weapon, assaulting a police officer, which landed the officer in the hospital, and carrying an illegal firearm. They also found a ton of drugs on him. Sometimes I think about how close I came to being one of his victims. If I'd just listened to my friends, maybe I wouldn't have ended up in that mess. But at least now he's rotting where he belongs. A few years back, when I was 23, I threw myself into dating. It wasn't so much about finding the one as it was about having fun. You could call it my wild phase, my carefree era, or just a time of avoidance. Whatever the label, I was dodging reality. I wasn't ready to face getting older. The thought of wrinkles, thinning hair, or anything that screamed aging was horrifying to me. Even though I didn't have to worry about it yet, my fear of growing older bordered on obsessive. It wasn't healthy, and I knew it, but I was too deep in my denial to care. One of the guys I met during this period was a dude named Caleb. Caleb had a pretty unique living situation. He shared his house with his grandfather. At first it seemed odd, but when he explained that his parents were gone and he took care of his granddad, it made sense. Still, when we started hanging out, I had no idea the old man was even there. The night I found out was one I'll never forget. It was close to 3 a.m., and both of us were tipsy, giddy, and absolutely infatuated. We'd spent the night drinking and flirting, and now we were heading back to his place. Don't worry, we were responsible enough to call for a rideshare. Even so, the fare nearly drained my wallet. When we pulled up to his house, nothing about it stood out. It was an average one-story place in a quiet neighborhood. Caleb led me to the porch, rummaged around under a doormat for a hidden key, and unlocked the front door. Everything felt completely normal, until it didn't. The light in the hallway was faint, barely enough to make out details, but I figured it was just left on for convenience. Caleb's house seemed so modest, almost too small to imagine more than one person living there. The driveway was empty too, which lined up with what Caleb told me earlier. He didn't have a car because he hadn't gotten his license yet. It all felt very quiet, very ordinary. We went straight to his room, and one thing led to another. I'll spare you the specifics. You don't need that kind of imagery clogging your mind, especially if you're relaxing or eating. But let's just say it was probably the most fun I'd had in ages. Caleb had some serious skills, and I wasn't complaining. Afterward, as we lay there, my throat started to feel dry. I decided to go downstairs for some water. Caleb followed me into the kitchen, offering food like a good host, but it was so late it was almost early. I just wanted to chug a glass of water and collapse into sleep. I downed my drink, rinsed the glass, and placed it upside down on the dish rack. Caleb stayed in the kitchen, messing around with the fridge, probably making himself a snack. Meanwhile, I dragged myself back upstairs, where the house was even quieter than before. Most of the rooms were pitch dark. The hallway light was still on, like when we arrived earlier, and the kitchen light stayed on too since Caleb was still down there. Besides that, the only other light came from Caleb's bedroom. It was strange, realizing how empty the house felt. It was just the two of us, or so I thought. Back in his room, I slid into the double bed. Thank God for that, by the way. I'd been with guys who only had single beds, and let me tell you, that's not cozy. Double beds are made for situations like this. I dimmed the overhead light and switched off the bedside lamp completely, settling into the quiet, dim room. Caleb could keep cooking his midnight bacon or whatever. I was done for the night. My head hit the pillow, and before I knew it, I was out cold. I'm not usually the kind of person who freaks out easily. Growing up, my mom always said I was too laid back for my own good. She liked to remind me how terrible my street smarts were, how I never seemed to spot danger even when it was right in front of me. That night, I guess I proved her right again. I'd only been asleep for what felt like a couple of minutes when a strange noise woke me up. It was this faint, shuffling sound at the foot of the bed. At first, I couldn't place it, so I just lay there, half asleep, assuming it was Caleb moving around, maybe getting ready for bed. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to ignore it, but the noise didn't stop. It got louder. Then, I felt it. Something cold brushed against my ankle. My heart nearly exploded as I bolted upright, pressing myself against the headboard. My eyes darted to the end of the bed, and that's when I saw him. Standing there, completely naked, was an old man. He must have been pushing 90, his skin pale and wrinkled under the dim light. He was just staring at me. I screamed. Not just a little yelp, but a full-on, blood-curdling scream. I didn't even think. I just scrambled off the bed, nearly tripping over myself as I ran for the door. I shoved past the man and darted into the dark hallway, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Before I could get far, Caleb came rushing up the stairs, his face a mix of shock and something like resignation, like he already knew what I'd just seen. When we met on the stairs, I grabbed him instinctively, clinging to him as I tried to catch my breath. I was shaking, my pulse pounding in my ears. Caleb didn't even need to ask what had happened. He turned and headed back toward his room, muttering something about his grandfather. I followed him down to the kitchen, needing a moment to compose myself, but by then I knew. I had to leave. It took Caleb about 15 minutes to get the old man dressed and back to bed. I could hear the muffled exchange from downstairs, the old man's voice repeating over and over, "Where's the girl? The girl? The girl? Who's the girl?" His words made my skin crawl. I didn't know if I wanted to cry, throw up, or both. Why was he naked? What was he trying to do? I felt sorry for Caleb, having to deal with this, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about how terrifying it was. When Caleb finally came back downstairs, he told me it was all clear. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted up to his room, threw on my clothes, grabbed my shoes and bag, and bolted. Before leaving, I downed another glass of water to shake off the lingering alcohol, then walked out the door without looking back. The next morning, I blocked Caleb on every platform I could think of. I never spoke to him again. Forget haunted houses, creepy woods, or whatever else people are scared of. None of it compares to waking up with a naked old man clutching your ankle at the end of a stranger's bed. To this day, I still can't think about that night without my stomach twisting into knots. Yeah, good times. I used to work at a small motel chain in the South as a night shift clerk. My hours were typically from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., so you can imagine I've seen some strange stuff. Being a 25-year-old woman at the time, it felt like those weird encounters were inevitable. The scariest moment happened just a few weeks into the job, and it's something I still think about. That evening I was killing time before my shift on Tinder. I matched with this guy who had a bit of a punk goth vibe. Totally my type. He mentioned he was into things like Ouija boards and tarot cards, which made me even more interested. We messaged back and forth for a bit until I told him I had to get ready for work. He seemed cool, so I didn't think much of it at the time. That night was also my first time working completely alone, which already had me feeling a little jittery. Around midnight, a man showed up at the front desk asking for me by name. He looked kind of familiar, but I couldn't immediately place him. Then it clicked. This was the guy from Tinder. My gut told me something was off. He explained that he saw I was nearby on the app and thought he'd check if I worked at this motel. I felt my stomach drop when he added that he had a room here. That was my second red flag. For the next 2 hours, he lingered by the desk, talking nonstop. At first, it seemed harmless, but then the conversation shifted. He started ranting about his ex, talking about fights he'd been in, and making comments about wanting to hook up with me. I was trapped behind the counter, unsure how to handle it. I'd never dealt with something like this at work before. Eventually, around 2 or 3 a.m., he said he was heading back to his room, and I finally had a moment to breathe. Needing a break, I stepped outside for a smoke, but just as I lit up, I heard footsteps behind me. It was him. I dug a little deeper into his Tinder profile and learned he was an artist, apparently in town for some mural project. He wasn't a local, which made me feel even more uneasy. As we stood outside, he kept inching closer to me while rambling about where he was from and his wild past. Then he asked if he could smoke weed. Desperate for any excuse to get him away, I said sure, and pointed out a spot where there weren't any security cameras. Instead of walking off, he suddenly leaned in, took a deep sniff of my neck, and grabbed my butt. I reacted instantly, shoving him off and warning him not to touch me again. My hands were shaking as I stomped out my cigarette, grabbed my phone, and rushed back toward the building. Before I could call my manager, he yanked the phone out of my hands and started fiddling with it. I froze as he texted himself from my number, giving him my contact info. My stomach twisted when the first message he sent was a horrifying picture of his heavily modified private parts. I'd seen some odd things online, but this was on a whole other level. The messages didn't stop there. My phone kept lighting up with grotesque BDSM-style images, each captioned with something worse than the last. "I can't wait to try this on you," one read, followed by, "You know where to find me." At this point, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. But the worst was yet to come. He sent a video, and despite every instinct telling me not to, I clicked it. I'll spare the details, but it was a violent snuff film with deeply disturbing sexual content. My breathing turned shallow as panic set in. I bolted to the back office, locked the door, and broke down crying. For hours I stayed there, my mind racing with what to do. By the time I pulled myself together, it was time to prep the hotel's breakfast bar. The texts didn't stop over the next few days, but I couldn't bring myself to block him or call the police. Finally, when I couldn't handle it anymore, I told my boss. To his credit, he acted fast, kicking the guy out and banning him from the property. He even flagged the man's company to prevent any future bookings at our location. Still, the whole experience haunts me. I should have called the cops, but at the time, I was just too scared to think clearly. It was about 6 years ago when this happened. Back then, I was in my 3rd year at college, still figuring things out. I was single and thought it might be fun to try a dating app. After swiping through more profiles than I'd like to admit, I finally matched with someone. She was stunning, slim, but curvy in all the right places. The kind of girl you don't think you'd actually meet. We started chatting right away, and she didn't beat around the bush. It was clear we were on the same page, so it didn't take long before we planned to meet. She picked a hotel for our first encounter, and things went so well that it became our go-to spot. I paid for everything, which was fine since I had a part-time job. But it wasn't like I was rolling in cash. A few times it got tight, especially when she hit me up just before I got paid. One time, I had to tell her no. That's when she invited me to her parents' house. That threw me off. I didn't think we were at the meet the family stage, and honestly, I wasn't ready for that. But she insisted, saying I could sneak in late at night, around 9 p.m., and no one would notice. I hesitated. It was a long trip, and her request felt strange. Still, the memories of our hotel meetups nudged me into saying yes. She gave me her address, and I figured out it was about a 15-minute walk from the train station. When I arrived, the house looked normal, maybe even boring. Nothing felt off. The whole neighborhood seemed a bit empty, though. A lot of houses had that no-one's-home vibe. The area was pretty isolated, too, way out in the countryside near Gunma. Getting into her room was like something out of a bad spy movie. I had to climb up to a second-floor window, but once inside, her room was exactly what I expected. Pink walls, shelves stuffed with plush toys. It was clear she'd grown up there. She met me with a whisper. "My parents are asleep in the next room. Don't make a sound, okay? They wake up around 6 a.m., so you'll have to leave before then." Her voice was shaky, but I brushed it off. What came next was as good as ever. The added thrill of sneaking around making it even better. Afterward, I wanted a cigarette. Climbing back out wasn't appealing, so I cracked the window open instead. She didn't like it. She hated smoking, but I promised to blow it outside. That's when I heard it. A voice, high-pitched and sharp, came from somewhere close. "I'll kill you," it said, clear as day. Footsteps followed, fast and angry, heading straight for us. She froze, eyes wide, and whispered urgently, "Hide! Right now! You'll die if they find you!" There were tears brimming in her eyes, and the fear in her voice made my blood run cold. The second I heard that voice, I knew I was in serious trouble. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I looked around the room, desperate for somewhere to hide, and the closet was my only option. I slipped inside, gently closing the door behind me, and tried to calm my breathing. Not a second later, the bedroom door slammed open with a loud bang, making me flinch. Her mom stormed in, her voice sharp and angry. "Are you smoking again?" she snapped. "So what if I am?" she shot back, her voice defiant but shaky. "You know the rules. You're not even 21 yet, and your dad will lose it if he smells smoke in the house." "I won't do it again, okay? Just leave me alone," she replied, trying to dismiss her mom quickly. She was protecting me, and for a brief moment, I thought I might actually get out of this mess. But then, I made the dumbest mistake. My foot slipped, and I lost my balance for just a second. The back of my head lightly hit the wall with a dull thud. Everything went silent. Her mom's voice cut through the quiet. "Who's in there?" I heard her footsteps move toward the closet. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought she might leave. The bedroom door opened and I heard her step outside. But then the footsteps came back, louder this time, heading straight for me. The closet door ripped open with one hard pull, and there I was, standing there like an idiot in nothing but my underwear. Her mom stared at me, her eyes narrowing like she was sizing me up. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. I stammered, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing came out. Then I saw it. She was holding a hammer. But this wasn't some regular hammer you'd use to hang a picture. It looked like a mini sledgehammer, heavy and brutal. "Get out, now. If you don't, you won't make it out alive," she said, her voice low and deadly serious. I didn't need any more convincing. Grabbing my clothes, I bolted, pulling on my jeans as I ran down the hallway. I didn't stop until I reached the train station, my heart pounding the whole way. It was the middle of the night, and I had to wait hours for the first train to show up. I sat there, replaying everything in my head, too freaked out to sleep. When I finally got back home, I sent her a quick apology message, more out of guilt than anything else. Her reply made my blood run cold. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I'm just glad my dad didn't wake up. He's in a gang, and let's just say he doesn't like meeting my boyfriends. One time, he took a guy for a drive, and I never saw him again. Hope he doesn't find you." She ended it with a laughing emoji, but it didn't feel like a joke. Suddenly, her mom's warning made a lot more sense. This wasn't just some overprotective parent. Her family was dangerous. And the worst part? I had told her where I lived. After that, I deleted the app and stopped meeting strangers in sketchy places. I told my friends where I was going anytime I met someone new. That whole experience shook me up, and I realized I needed to start taking things seriously. Some risks just aren't worth it. This occurred a few years back. I reluctantly downloaded Tinder out of curiosity. Meeting people face to face always felt more natural to me, but I thought trying an app wouldn't hurt, especially since a friend of mine met her fiancé on there. Eventually, I matched with someone I'll refer to as A. We started chatting on a Sunday night. I logged off around 10:30 p.m. and didn't check my phone again until lunchtime the next day, after my morning gym session and work. When I finally glanced at my phone, I saw a Tinder notification from A. She had sent a couple of lengthy messages about deeply personal matters. Her last one said, "Did I scare you off?" I quickly recorded a voice note to a friend, asking if it was just me or if her messages seemed a bit much. It felt like a small warning sign, but I replied anyway, explaining that I'd been busy and had just seen her messages. Over the next week, we kept chatting, though a few things about her raised alarms in my mind. At the time, I thought I was just overthinking. Throughout our conversations, she brought up her ex several times and gave me compliments non-stop. On our second day talking, she asked for my number, but I told her I wasn't ready yet. She didn't take it well. When I explained I needed more time, she said, "Ask me anything," as if that was supposed to speed up the process. Reflecting on it now, it feels like she was trying to manipulate the situation to get closer, faster. I should probably mention here that I'm a woman too. I shared that she'd moved here from another country because her parents couldn't accept her being gay. She also told me she was estranged from her mom, which became important later. As our chats went on, she started being even more forward, constantly calling me the most beautiful person she'd ever seen. It was flattering, but also overwhelming. Her profile showed she lived just an hour away, but despite the proximity, her behavior made me hesitant to meet in person. Still, I convinced myself I was being too judgmental and continued talking to her. By the fifth day, A asked for my number again. This time, I gave in. The second I did, she texted me saying, "I really hope you don't regret this." At the time, it gave me a slight chill, but I shrugged it off. The very next day, she messaged, saying she wanted to ask me something. When I said okay, she asked when she could take me out. I hesitated and told her I wasn't sure. That's when she started piling on the guilt, saying we'd been talking for long enough and that it was time we met. I had this gnawing feeling, like agreeing would be a mistake. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a weird vibe I couldn't shake. But instead of trusting that gut instinct, I caved a little and said we could meet on a Saturday. Almost instantly, she locked down the next Saturday, suggesting we grab coffee and take a walk. It felt rushed, and I didn't like how quickly she decided for us. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. I didn't want to come across as paranoid, even though my instincts were practically yelling at me to call it off. Here's where I made another dumb move. She insisted on driving to meet me, despite it supposedly being 2 hours away. This was strange because her Tinder profile had her listed as living only an hour from me. When I suggested meeting halfway, she ignored me and said she'd just come straight to where I live. At that point, I started to feel really uncomfortable. Things got worse when she casually mentioned coming to my house after coffee. I froze for a moment and told her no, saying I wasn't okay with her coming over. What she said next made my skin crawl and still makes me cringe to this day. She responded, "Well, when I fuck you, it has to be at your place. I share a bed with my mom right now." I was stunned. I mean, I don't judge what other people do, but for her to say something so explicit, especially when I barely knew her, was completely off-putting. It wasn't just her words, it was the pushiness, the way she bulldozed over any boundaries I tried to set. I felt trapped, like I'd already made too many mistakes to back out cleanly. Sex is something I take seriously, and A's behavior gave me nothing but bad vibes. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she spoke, like she'd already decided we were going to sleep together. That alone made me uneasy. We'd moved our conversations to WhatsApp, and if you're not familiar, there's a way to read messages from the notification bar without actually opening the app. For some reason, that's what I did when her latest message came through. Normally, I'd open it immediately, but this time I hesitated. I knew the second I clicked on it, she'd see that I'd read it. Feeling unsure, I called my best friend and spilled everything. She'd been telling me for days that I wasn't overreacting, that if something felt wrong, it probably was. When I told her about the cringy comment A made about sex, she burst out laughing, not because it was funny, but out of pure disbelief and secondhand embarrassment. Then there was the part about her sharing a bed with her mom. That detail stuck with me in the worst way. She'd claimed earlier that she didn't even speak to her mom anymore. According to her, her mom lived in another country and cut her off for being gay. So, was that a lie? And even if it wasn't, why would a grown woman in her mid-20s be sharing a bed with her mom? It didn't make sense, and the whole situation felt increasingly off. As my thoughts spiraled, A sent another message, saying she'd smacked her aunt recently but that it was just a joke. She even reassured me that I'd never have to worry about her hitting me. That was the final straw. I told my friend about it, and she insisted I should ghost A and block her on everything. So that's what I did. I blocked her number and her WhatsApp profile without responding. But the next morning, I woke up to a new message from a different number. It was A, asking what she had done to deserve being ignored. My friends agreed it was strange, but I couldn't shake the guilt. I hate ghosting people. It feels so immature and cruel. After 5 days of thinking it over, I decided to unblock her and send a message. I wanted to be upfront, to explain why I'd been uncomfortable instead of just disappearing. At the time, I thought it was the right thing to do, to handle it like an adult. I sent A message, reintroducing myself and saying I wanted to explain why I had ghosted her. She responded quickly saying, "Go ahead, explain." So I did. I laid it all out, the way she'd acted, the things she'd said that made me uncomfortable, her response. First of all, I've never been violent toward women. I'm not aggressive. Wrestling with my aunt was just a joke. Then she turned it around, telling me I had issues and that it was absurd I didn't want to meet her. According to her, the problem wasn't her moving too fast. It was me moving too slow. She added, "I was only asking you out on a date, not proposing marriage, and it wasn't just about sex." But of course, she ignored the part where she invited herself to my house and said she was going to fuck me. She insisted she wasn't using me for sex, but also claimed sex wasn't a big deal and there was no point in waiting around since she already liked me. Her tone was dismissive and entitled, and it made my blood boil. It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she assumed what I wanted without ever asking me. Then, she compared me to her ex. "You're just like my toxic ex who cheated on me for 2 years," she said. I stayed because I'm a loyal person. It felt like she was calling me toxic, just because I didn't want to sleep with her after she bulldozed over my boundaries. I was furious, but I also realized there was no point in continuing the conversation. I'd done what I set out to do, explain myself. There was no use arguing with someone who clearly didn't respect me. I sent her a final message, saying I wouldn't be in touch again. Later, she responded with, "Don't be too hard on yourself." The irony wasn't lost on me. I blocked her number again, and that was the last I heard from her. Honestly, I felt like I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. Looking back, this whole thing taught me to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. It's not paranoia, it's self-preservation. People who ignore your boundaries or act desperate to meet you are throwing up red flags, plain and simple. There were so many odd things about A, and I'm just relieved I never met her. If her messages were this unsettling, I can't imagine how it would have been in person. Stay safe out there, everyone. It was the summer of 2023 when I met this guy on Instagram. We dated for about 5 months, but there were so many things about him that felt off. I decided to break it off, though I'll admit I didn't handle it well. I ended things with a quick text. He didn't take it lightly. That Friday night, without any calls or messages, he just showed up at my apartment. He said he wanted to clear the air. I didn't want to seem rude, so I let him in, hoping to settle things quickly. What started as an awkward chat turned into a heated argument. He kept switching between blaming me and acting like we'd patch things up. One of the biggest reasons I ended things was because he couldn't respect my boundaries. He'd pressure me for intimacy constantly. It was disgusting how fast he went from shouting to trying to hold me, stroking my hair and whispering sweet nonsense. I was fed up. It was around 10 p.m. when I told him to leave, but he refused. We argued for hours, and by 1 a.m., I was exhausted and furious. He sat on my couch, clinging to my waist like a child, crying and begging me to just give him a chance. When I pushed him away, he started punching himself in the face and shouting, "I'm so stupid." It was terrifying to watch. Finally, by 2 a.m., I managed to push him out and lock the door. But instead of leaving, he sat on my porch, crying loudly like something from a horror movie. A few minutes later, I peeked through the curtains and saw him pull out a razor. He began slashing his thigh repeatedly, his jeans turning dark with blood. Then, he staggered back to my door, leaving bloody smears on the porch. He begged for bandages, promising he'd leave if I helped him. My hands were trembling as I grabbed a first aid kit, opened the door just enough to throw it outside, and slammed it shut again. I locked every door and window, my heart racing. For the next hour, he sat outside my apartment, wailing like an injured animal. I know I should have called the cops, but I felt sorry for him. He had a record, and I didn't want to make things worse for him. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous the situation was. When I was younger, maybe 13 or so, I developed a crazy crush on this guy at school. Over a few months, I became obsessed with everything about him. His messy hair, sharp jawline, and how he always seemed so effortlessly cool. To me, he was the center of the universe. Forget about homework or anything else. All I wanted was to be close to him. It's hard to describe, but it was like my brain was on some kind of love drug whenever I saw him. Let's call him Ryan. Ryan felt like my dream come true, even though he didn't even know I existed at first. I'd spend every lunch break and free moment trying to get his attention. I'd wear different outfits, sit where he could see me, or even nudge my friends to casually talk to him about me. Nothing seemed to work. He was my age but carried himself like someone much older. It made him even more fascinating. Finally, after weeks of trying, one of his friends approached me and said Ryan wanted my number. My heart nearly stopped. I tried to play it cool, handed over my phone, and watched as his friend typed it in. That moment felt like the beginning of everything I dreamed about. The second I got home, I texted him. I didn't care if it made me look desperate. I'd waited forever for this. I sent a simple, "Hey," with a couple of emojis. And to my surprise, he responded quickly. At first, our conversations were light and casual, just your usual small talk. But by the third day, things started to change. Ryan sent me random pictures of his pets, a scruffy dog and 2 cats. At first, I thought it was adorable. His dog was some kind of spaniel, the floppy-eared kind, and the cats were these sleek, dark-furred ones. But then the photos got weird. Ryan started sending videos instead of pictures, and they weren't cute anymore. In one, he was teasing the animals in ways that made my stomach turn. The pets were locked in cages, and I could hear him laughing in the background, this strange, breathy laugh like he was enjoying it way too much. He thought it was funny, but it made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off and change the subject, but the videos kept coming. One was of him holding his cat up by a leash he'd made out of rope. Another showed him poking the dog with something sharp. I should have blocked him right then, but I didn't. I told myself he was just joking around, or maybe I didn't want to believe someone I liked so much could be so twisted. When we finally met in person, he was the same Ryan I'd fallen for. Charming, funny, and so easy to talk to. It was like none of the videos had ever happened. We went to the local bowling alley, and to my surprise, I actually beat him. Ryan wasn't thrilled about losing, and I could tell it bruised his ego a bit. To make up for it, I suggested we grab a bite to eat at this old diner I used to love as a kid. We ordered a pile of greasy fries and some popcorn chicken, laughed about random things, and stuffed ourselves. Afterward, we walked back toward my house. When we got to my door, though, Ryan wouldn't come in. He mumbled something about my parents being home and waved it off like it wasn't a big deal. We hugged goodbye, and just like that, our first date was over. At least that's what I thought at the time. Later that night, I climbed into bed, replaying the whole evening in my head. On one hand, Ryan had been everything I wanted, charming, funny, and so easy to talk to. But on the other hand, the stuff he'd sent me before, the twisted videos of his pets, kept creeping back into my mind. I couldn't make sense of it. How could someone who seemed so perfect have such a dark side? I chalked it up to overthinking and started to drift off, but something about the whole day just felt off. That's when I heard it. A faint knock on my window. My heart jumped into my throat. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, steady and deliberate. I froze, too scared to even breathe. I wanted to scream, but something stopped me. Deep down, a part of me already knew who it was. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back, but I couldn't see much. It was pitch black outside. All I could make out was a dark shape standing just beyond the glass. I stepped back and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Who else could it be? It had to be Ryan. No one else would knock on my window in the middle of the night. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the figure, expecting to see him standing there, grinning, maybe trying to coax me outside for some late-night mischief. Honestly, I was so caught up in my feelings for him that I might have gone along with it, even though I knew it was probably a bad idea. But when the light hit him, it wasn't what I expected. Ryan wasn't standing there with his usual smirk or some flirtatious comment ready to go. Instead, he was eerily calm. His expression was blank, almost lifeless. Then, without saying a word, he slowly lifted his left hand. In his hand was our neighbor's orange tabby. He had the poor thing by its neck, holding it up like it weighed nothing. The cat was thrashing, clawing at the air, trying to escape. Before I could even process what was happening, Ryan pulled out a knife. My breath caught as he plunged the blade straight into the cat's stomach. He dragged it downward with a sickening sound, and the cat's insides spilled out onto the ground. I felt bile rising in my throat. My body wanted to vomit, but I was frozen, just dry heaving as I stared in shock. Ryan dropped the lifeless cat on the lawn like it was garbage and sprinted off into the darkness. He didn't leave a single clue. No knife, no jacket, just a trail of footprints in the dirt and the grotesque sight of the cat's body lying there. I couldn't stop shaking. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed, and the image stayed burned into my brain. The next morning, as if nothing had happened, Ryan texted me. "Did you like it? Wasn't it amazing?" My hands trembled as I read it. I didn't reply. When the cops showed up at my house, I played dumb. I didn't tell them what I saw or that I knew who did it. My parents believed it was a random act of cruelty, but I think they suspected I wasn't being honest. The police eventually pieced it together without my help. They figured out it was Ryan and tracked him down. He got sent to juvie, locked away for years. When they searched his house, it made the local news. He lived with a stepdad who was apparently a violent drunk. Ryan's room was a nightmare. Cages stacked on top of each other, belts and chains hanging on the walls, and tools that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. The whole place reeked of cruelty. It turned out he'd been torturing animals for years, taking out his anger on anything smaller than him. Word spread fast, and soon everyone at school knew I'd dated him. Kids whispered about me in the hallways, cracking jokes and calling me names. I became the girl who dated the psycho. Looking back, I can't believe I let myself get pulled in. If he hadn't been so good-looking, I doubt I'd have given him the time of day. But at the time, I was too blinded by his charm to see the monster beneath. Even now, years later, I still can't wrap my head around it. What haunted me most wasn't just the violence. It was the fact that Ryan thought I'd enjoy it. Like I was supposed to find it thrilling or funny. I never gave him any reason to think that. It was such a twisted assumption, and it still makes my skin crawl. By the time he got out of juvie, I was in college. I never heard from him again, and honestly, I didn't want to. Part of me assumes he's in prison now, probably graduated from hurting animals to hurting people. That's what they say, right? It starts with animals, and then it escalates. It's such a waste. He could have been anything. He was so handsome, like something out of a magazine. But instead, he chose to be a monster. When I was in my second year at college, around 20 years old, I had a strange experience that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I wasn't a big fan of dating apps, but one night, feeling lonely and encouraged by my roommates, I swiped through Tinder. To my surprise, I matched with a guy named Jason. He was charming in his texts, funny and sweet, and he seemed like he had his life together, working a good job while going to school nearby. As someone who'd been through a few bad relationships, opening up was hard for me. Trust didn't come easy. But Jason had this way of making me feel comfortable. Still, something about our chats made me uneasy. At first, I chalked it up to my own anxiety, thinking I was just overthinking things. But as the days went on, that weird feeling grew. It was this gnawing sense of dread I couldn't explain, especially when he started saying things like how he couldn't wait for me to meet his family, or how perfect I'd be as his girlfriend, after just a few weeks of texting. That's when I started to pull away. I'd leave his messages on read or respond less often, hoping he'd lose interest. But the guilt ate at me. When I finally told my roommates about it, they rolled their eyes and said I was being unfair to him, that I was letting my past mess up my chance at something new. So, feeling stupid and pressured, I messaged him again. He seemed thrilled, and for the next couple of weeks, we chatted more often, like before. Then he asked me out for dinner. I didn't want to go. Something about it felt off, but my friends insisted it would be good for me. "You've got to push through your nerves," they said. So, I agreed. Jason was ecstatic, telling me he'd made a reservation at a fancy Japanese restaurant not far from campus. That night, as we got ready, my friends begged to see his pictures. I pulled up his Tinder profile for them, and as they scrolled through, their excitement faded into silence. "You know, he kind of looks like Mark," one of my friends said hesitantly, staring at Jason's picture on my phone. My stomach dropped. Mark was an ex I'd rather erase from my memory. A guy who left me with scars I still wasn't fully over. Seeing that resemblance flipped a switch in me, and I spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. I knew there was no way I could go through with meeting Jason. That night, I sent him a message apologizing and told him I didn't feel comfortable going out anymore. He never responded. A few days later, I started getting these weird phone calls from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemails they left weren't exactly threatening, but they were unsettling. Stuff like, "Why won't you call me back, babe? And come on, give me a chance." I ignored them at first, hoping they'd stop. But after getting almost a dozen calls in one day, I snapped and answered, ready to lose it on whoever was messing with me. "Jason, what the hell is your problem?" I yelled as soon as I picked up. But the voice on the other end wasn't his. "This isn't Jason. This is Ryan," the guy said, his tone oddly cheerful. I froze. "Who?" "Jason said I could have you," Ryan replied, laughing like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but I didn't stick around to hear more. I hung up, my hands shaking, but he called back immediately. I didn't answer, so he left a voicemail that made my skin crawl. "Jason said you're into me. He told me where you go to school and sent me your pictures. If you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. I'll just wait for you on campus." I blocked the number, but for the next few days, I kept getting calls from other unknown numbers. Each voicemail was worse than the last, full of creepy, disgusting comments and weird threats. Eventually, the calls stopped, but by then, the damage was done. I was jumpy all the time, constantly looking over my shoulder when I walked anywhere. My roommates were freaked out too. One of them called a guy friend to stay with us for a couple of weeks just in case. I started going back to my parents' place every weekend because I couldn't handle being on campus for too long. It's been 3 years since all of this happened, and I still get chills thinking about it. I don't know if Jason and Ryan were just trying to mess with me, or if they were genuinely dangerous. Either way, I hope someone has taught them a lesson, or at least made them think twice before pulling something like that on someone else. Back in the late 80s, things felt a lot more straightforward. Dating wasn't complicated, meeting people seemed natural. Everything, including relationships, had this simplicity to it. If you lived through that time, you'd know exactly what I mean. But even back then, before phones and the internet ruled our lives, the world had its dangers lurking in plain sight. Simpler didn't always mean safer. That night, I was prepping for a date. She was supposed to show up around 8 p.m., but I started getting ready early. I knew myself too well. I always managed to run late no matter what. After a quick shower and a hurried round of brushing and combing my hair, I ran downstairs to check on my dog, Max. Max was a black Labrador who had been my buddy for over a decade. He wasn't the lively pup he used to be. At 14, his back legs barely worked anymore, but he still had the heart of the energetic dog he once was. It was bittersweet seeing him like this, a shadow of his younger self. When the car pulled up outside, my stomach did a little flip. My cousin had introduced me to her, Emily, a few months back at one of those big family barbecues. Our family loved those summer gatherings. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers would end up invited. One time, someone brought a guy off the street who tried to pocket stuff from the kitchen. Wild times. But Emily wasn't just another guest. She had this charm that made her stand out, and now she was here for our first date. I heard her knock on the door, and for a second, I thought about turning back. My nerves had me frozen. Even though I was in my early 20s, I wasn't exactly smooth with women. I grabbed Max's collar to keep him from going wild. He was barking like crazy, all excited, but his legs didn't move fast enough to match his mood. The vet had suggested surgery that might help, but the cost, nearly $9,000, was just out of reach for me. As I opened the door, Emily stood there, looking radiant under the porch light, her smile warm and inviting. She locked eyes with me, her smile sharp enough to slice through my nerves. The red lipstick on her lips seemed a little smudged, but somehow it added to the moment, making her look more real, less untouchable. Her eyes held mine for a second too long, making my pulse quicken. I invited her inside, showing her the tiny kitchen and the cramped living room. Max was instantly obsessed with her, wagging his tail so hard I thought it might fall off. He trailed her like a shadow, his excitement embarrassing me more with each passing second. Before I even had a chance to sit down, Max was all over her, licking her face like she was his long-lost best friend. His wet nose left streaks of drool on her makeup, ruining the careful lines of her lipstick. I scrambled to pull him off, my face burning with embarrassment. "Max, no!" I scolded, guiding him to his bed. Usually, he was a good boy when I got firm, and tonight was no different. He slumped into his bed, looking up at me with those sad eyes that always made me feel guilty. "Sorry about that," I muttered, grabbing some wipes from the kitchen. She just laughed, dabbing at her face with the wipes. From her purse, she pulled out a small, compact mirror and started fixing her makeup, still chuckling like the whole thing was no big deal. That laugh caught me off guard. My mom was the type of person who would have flipped out if something like that happened to her. A textbook Karen before the internet gave the term a name. But Emily? She rolled with it. When we finally left, Max watched us through the window, barking like crazy as we backed out of the driveway. Her car, a beat-up old sedan that looked like it could fall apart any second, rumbled to life. I half expected it to break down before we even made it out of the neighborhood, but it surprised me. It got us all the way to the restaurant, though her driving was, let's just say, creative. The restaurant was one of those fancy spots with a view of the ocean and valet parking. As we pulled into the lot, I felt a pang of regret. I'd dressed casually, maybe a little too casually. Inside, everyone was dressed to impress. White shirts, tailored pants, sleek dresses. It felt like we'd crashed a high-end business meeting. We started with an appetizer and moved on to the main course. By the time dessert arrived, I'd managed to relax a little. We were sharing a slice of cheesecake, joking about the tiny portions, when the vibe in the restaurant shifted. The low hum of conversation seemed to evaporate, replaced by an eerie, heavy quiet. I noticed Emily acting strange, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for something, or someone. "What's up?" I whispered, trying to follow her gaze. That's when it hit me. The restaurant wasn't just quieter, it was practically dead silent. The restaurant had this strange buzz to it, mostly coming from a large group near the middle. There were 8 tables shoved together, with about 20 people crammed around them. They were loud, laughing, shouting, even clapping like they were at some kind of celebration. It was the kind of noise you don't really notice after a while, fading into the background like static. Emily picked up on it first, though. Her whole posture shifted, and she stopped eating. That big group? They went from rowdy to stone silent in a heartbeat, all of them suddenly staring out the huge window that overlooked the ocean. It wasn't like they were zoning out either. They looked transfixed, frozen. Like something out there had grabbed hold of them. I turned to see what they were looking at, craning my neck around to get a view. From where I sat, all I could see was the faint shimmer of waves in the moonlight. But Emily had a front row seat, her eyes wide as she whispered, "Do you see them?" I followed her gaze to 4 men standing in the parking lot, all in sharp suits, their silhouettes sharp against the glowing streetlights. At first, I figured they were late to the party, maybe friends or colleagues of the loud group, ready to storm in and get teased for showing up last. But the vibe shifted fast. The people at the joined tables weren't laughing anymore, they were scared. Some stood up and walked toward the back of the room. Others made a break for the bathrooms. Those who stayed at the table looked pale and terrified. The suited men stepped closer to the restaurant's door. The group at the table started to cry, actual sobs, pleading under their breath like kids begging for mercy. And then, the doors opened, and everything exploded. Gunshots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Glass shattered, Chairs toppled and people screamed, their voices blending into a single chaotic roar. I barely had time to react before Emily yanked me to the floor. We huddled under the table, clinging to each other as rounds of bullets tore through the air above us. I could hear people begging, crying, pleading for their lives. When it was over, the silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. I opened my eyes and dared to peek out. The men had walked out as calmly as they'd entered, leaving behind a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. 8 people lay motionless, their bodies slumped over chairs, sprawled across the floor, blood pooling beneath them. Emily and I crawled out from under the table, our movements slow and shaky. The room was wrecked. Shards of glass glittered like jagged snowflakes. White tablecloths were soaked red, and the smell of coppery blood hung heavy in the air. It was real. Too real. The restaurant manager stumbled out from the back, his face pale and streaked with tears. He tried to save some of the victims, performing CPR and barking orders at staff who were just as panicked as he was. Emily and I jumped in to help, pressing napkins to wounds, holding people upright, doing whatever we could. In the end, only one person survived. The medics arrived quickly, maybe 10 minutes later, but it wasn't fast enough for the others. 7 people died right there in front of us, their lives slipping away no matter how hard we tried to hold on to them. Those who had hidden in the bathrooms made it out alive. Others who fled through the back weren't as lucky. The shooters caught up with them in the alley and finished what they'd started. It was a hit, gang-related, the police said later. Drugs, debts, something like that. They didn't give us much, probably to keep the details quiet. That night stuck with me, haunting my dreams like a scar you can't ever shake. I never saw Emily again after that. It wasn't her fault, but every time I thought about her, I thought about that night. The screams, the blood, the gunfire. I couldn't look at her without seeing it all over again. When I was a kid, there was someone I considered my best friend who completely wrecked my life. For the sake of this story, let's call him T. We met back in elementary school and hit it off almost instantly. Over time, we stayed close and even ended up at the same middle and high schools. Back then, I thought it was perfect. We'd walk to school together in the mornings and hang out afterward. Even my parents didn't mind when he stayed over, which was often. It never felt romantic. He was just my friend. I guess to outsiders it might have looked different since you didn't see many guy and girl friendships like ours. But to me, T was nothing more than a loyal companion. I trusted him enough to tell him when I started dating someone. I was nervous, unsure how he'd react. Would he tease me? Or would he be happy for me? I eventually told him, and at first, his reaction seemed pretty neutral. But later that day, during lunch, he punched through a classroom window. It rattled me, but I couldn't tell if it was related to what I'd shared with him. After that, T began acting off. His clinginess went through the roof. He wouldn't leave my side during school breaks, always waiting outside my classes. Every morning and afternoon, he was there, following me like a shadow. Then it escalated to non-stop calls, emails, and texts every night. If I didn't respond right away, he'd just flood my inbox even more. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was. I should have cut ties immediately, but at the time, I didn't want to hurt him. So, I kept replying, feeding into the behavior I now know I should have ignored. And then came the moment that changed everything. Waking up to find him standing outside my house. When I woke up that morning and saw him outside, it was barely past sunrise. Definitely not a normal time for anyone to be standing on someone's lawn. I was rattled. Some friends of mine, mostly the girls, told me I had to say something to him. So, the next day, I found him waiting for me by the school gate, like always, and I finally spoke up. "Hey T," I started, trying to keep my voice calm. "You know I told you I have a boyfriend, right? Maybe we should, have a bit of space between us." The moment those words left my mouth, his face twisted into something I'd never seen before. He looked furious. "Why?" he shot back, his voice rising. "I've been there for you all this time. I know you better than he ever could. I care about you more than anyone else, so why him? Why not me?" Before I could respond, he lunged toward me, trying to pull me into a hug. I stepped back just in time, my heart racing. But it didn't end there. T started showing up everywhere my boyfriend and I went. If we were out at the mall or grabbing coffee, he'd somehow find us. He didn't even try to hide it. Worse, when my boyfriend came over to visit, T would show up and ring the doorbell over and over until someone answered, or until he got tired and left. I was only a teenager then, and I had no idea how to handle someone like him. He was relentless. One time when my parents weren't home, it was just me and my boyfriend in the house. That's when I heard loud thuds against the front door. It was T, trying to force his way inside. As if that wasn't bad enough, he started spreading rumors at school, mostly targeting my boyfriend. Lies about him cheating, skipping classes, you name it. It felt like T's only goal was to break us up. When it became clear that he wasn't going to succeed, he seemed to lose interest in school altogether. He stopped showing up for classes and apparently gave up on applying for college. But the harassment didn't stop, it just shifted online. He sent bizarre messages from fake accounts and tried adding me under random usernames. I learned quickly to block anything that looked even slightly suspicious. Right before I left town for college, I heard people whispering that T had ended up in some kind of institution. I don't know if it's true. I can't say for sure. A part of me hopes it's not. As messed up as things got, he was my best friend once. I try to hold on to that memory, even if it feels like it's from a different lifetime. After high school, I moved in with my boyfriend. We rented a small place together, and we're still living there now. Sometimes, I catch myself thinking about T. Is he still out there? Is he watching? I keep my online presence minimal. No addresses, no work details. If he was that bad as a teenager, I don't even want to imagine what he'd be like now. This happened back when I was a college junior, and my girlfriend had just started a new job. We were still getting to know each other, but I spent a lot of time at her place. Honestly, it felt like I lived there. One evening, she told me about her ex-boyfriend. Apparently, he kept calling her, showing up uninvited, and even waiting outside her door just to talk. "Want me to handle this guy for you?" I asked, half joking but also serious. "No, he's harmless," she said, brushing it off. "Okay, but if you don't want me involved, why not call the cops?" "This is harassment," I pressed. "I broke up with him. It's kind of my fault he's like this," she sighed. No matter what I said, she wouldn't report him. And honestly, he didn't seem dangerous, just annoying. That summer, she went back to visit her family in Denver. She told me I could stay at her place while she was gone, and I jumped at the chance. A week alone with her big screen TV? I was ready for non-stop gaming sessions. The day after she left was her birthday. I felt a little bad we couldn't celebrate together, but we'd only been dating for a couple of months. At midnight, I paused my game to text her a happy birthday message. The room was unbearably hot, so I cranked up the AC. The only light came from the glow of the TV as I dived back into my game. I was so focused, I barely registered the sound of the doorbell. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was 11:30 p.m. Who shows up this late? Not my apartment, not my problem, I thought. The ringing didn't stop, though. Whoever it was, they were persistent. And then came the knocking. Heavy, impatient thuds. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Open up, it's me." The voice was muffled but familiar. Her ex. Maybe he came by to wish her a happy birthday, but she wasn't even home. I froze, not wanting him to know I was inside. No telling how he'd react. I muted my game and sat still, watching the door like it might burst open. It was almost midnight when I heard his footsteps fade down the hall. Finally, he's leaving, I thought, relieved. I grabbed my phone and started typing a text to my girlfriend, telling her what had just happened. But before I could finish, a faint, high-pitched squeak from the direction of the window made my blood run cold. Was he climbing? I turned off the TV and slid down onto the floor, hiding behind the bed. My heart pounded as a shadow loomed against the curtains on the balcony. Then came the banging. Sharp, insistent thuds against the glass. The figure behind the curtain shifted, moving back and forth, like he was searching for an opening to peek through. "I know you're in there. Open up." His voice was low, but forceful. My mind raced. How does he know I'm here? Did I make a noise? Then it clicked. The air conditioner. The unit outside must have given me away. I stayed perfectly still, hoping he'd give up. But the banging continued. It was relentless, his voice getting louder, more frustrated. After what felt like forever, I heard the squeaking sound again. He must be climbing back down. I stayed frozen, my ears straining for any sound. Finally, silence. Slowly, I crawled to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole, just to make sure he was gone. What I saw made my heart drop. He was still there. His face was inches from the door, his ear pressed against it, listening. I didn't even dare to breathe. I stayed completely still, my gaze locked on him. Then he moved. He crouched low, out of view. I didn't understand what he was doing until I heard the mail slot snap open. A chill ran through me. Thank God the slot had a hood over it, blocking his view into the apartment. I shifted one leg back against the wall, keeping it out of sight. A hand appeared through the slot, fingers wriggling blindly. My stomach tightened. He wasn't just reaching in. He was feeling around with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was doing. His hand held a strange L-shaped tool that gleamed faintly in the dim light. A set square, I realized. This wasn't random. He came prepared. The tool in his hand wobbled, edging closer to the lock. It scraped against the metal, sending chills down my spine. My breath hitched. He muttered something under his breath, his frustration growing. "Almost there," he hissed. I couldn't stay frozen. I had to act. Panic flooded me. Should I call the cops? Would they even get here in time? If I called, wouldn't he hear me on the phone? And what would I even say? This wasn't my apartment. Wouldn't that complicate things? Would my girlfriend freak out if I involved the police? My thoughts spiraled. Do I fight him? What if he loses it when he realizes I'm here? Could I grab a knife? Could I even use it if it came to that? My heart raced as I struggled to figure out what to do. The tool was nearly in the lock. I had no time left to think. Acting on pure instinct, I lashed out with my foot, slamming it against his arm as hard as I could. At the same moment, I reached up and quickly slid the chain lock into place. His arm shot back through the mail slot, the tool clattering to the floor outside. Silence. Then, a loud bang. The door rattled under the force of his kick. My stomach dropped. He wasn't giving up. My girlfriend's apartment wasn't exactly secure. It was old, and the door didn't look like it could handle much abuse. Another kick landed, and the whole frame shook. I heard other doors in the hallway creak open, followed by murmurs. Some neighbors were peeking out, probably to see what all the noise was about. Through the peephole, I saw him glance around, then bolt down the hall. His heavy footsteps echoed as he ran. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I couldn't stop shaking. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. My body was too tense, my mind racing with what-ifs. When my girlfriend returned, I told her everything. I begged her to move as soon as possible. The thought of her being home alone when this happened chilled me to the core. Thankfully, she agreed. We packed up and left, starting over in a new town, far from the city where this all happened. She changed her number, cutting off any way for him to contact her again. But I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere, still obsessed. Sometimes, when I'm walking down the street, I catch myself scanning faces. I can't help but wonder if one of them might be him.